Good afternoon, and welcome to this session on Caesars and Cleopatras, sex and power in the ancient world. And we have a most wonderful panel to help us do this. In order to set the tone for it, I just wanted to draw attention to something I picked up at my house just before I left home yesterday. This is a book from 1962, when I was before even I was a student. It was called Roman Women, Their History and Habits. I mean, by a man called, an Oxford Don at the time, Their History and Habits, which really does sound as though women were basically a sort of tribe that he'd sort of discovered up the Amazon Delta and had to be taken apart in this particular way. It's actually a pretty good book, but the mindset is an important one for us, because actually the way the Romans saw women was very different. They were different in many ways, and it's important when we understand them, to talk about them to understand that, not just because old Oxford Dons thought that. So anyway, we have the perfect panel to discuss this today. On my left, we have the wonderful Daisy Dunn, who has written an extraordinary new book called The Missing Thread. Let me get this right. The Missing Thread. I nearly missed it. Which it very cleverly tells the story of ancient history by forwarding the women who previously would have been in most histories in the background. It's a wonderful thing. And far away over there, we have Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, who's a distinguished ancient history professor and vicar, as you can see, from Cardiff. A great speaker from both lectern and lecture theatre. Always very entertaining. And then in the middle we have the inimitable and needing no introduction Tom Holland, whose books set us up completely and perfectly from Rubicon onwards for the Roman part of what we're going to be talking about. He also tells me that he has written an opera about Cleopatra, as you do, and that it's about to be performed at the pyramids, or maybe performed at the pyramids. Possibly performed at the pyramids. And it's just possible, if we ask him nicely towards the end when we're going to have some questions, he might even sing us a bit. So
well, anyone who's heard me sing, be warned, get out before I start that.
A few more may have done so by the end. Anyway, to kick off on this question of how in antiquity women were and how they were seen. And I thought, just to get it specific, since we're doing Caesars and Cleopatras, we would choose a date, which is, we're going to a year before Caesar's assassination, so that's 45 BC. Cleopatra was actually in Rome. He brought her to Rome. And she was an object of some interest. And I thought Daisy might set us off by describing Cleopatra in Rome on that day.
Well, I'd say Cleopatra immediately came in as an already sort of decided on divisive figure. She was a real sort of Marmite of the ancient world. Obviously, Julius Caesar thought she was wonderful, and they'd been together a couple of years by now. They had a child, Caesarion. But for the most part, the Roman people were quite suspicious of her, to say the least. So when she arrived, quite interestingly, she wasn't put up right in the throng. She wasn't right in the centre. She was put off in this little estate that Caesar had, the Horti Caesaris, the gardens of Caesar. So she wasn't quite in the middle. And the Romans were suspicious of her. I mean, Cicero defined it, he put it quite succinctly. He just wrote, "I hate the queen," in one of his letters. Another poet described her as the whore queen of Egypt. So quite mixed views of her, really, as she's arriving at that time.
Did they have a view of Egyptian women as being different from them? Was it just because she was Egyptian, or because she was a queen, or what? What constituted the difference for this hostility?
Well, I think there was a feeling, particularly among the more conservative elements of Rome, that she was very, very different, that she was disruptive, that she was manipulative. She had relationships, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony as well. She was, a figure who was seen to be sort of disrupting the normal running of Roman politics. And the Romans were, the Egyptians were quite odd, I have to say, to the Romans. Incest, a big thing in Egypt. So marrying your brother isn't seen as a normal way to carry on in Rome. And I think probably Cleopatra must have maybe felt slightly envious towards some of the Roman women who didn't have to go through that. On the flip side, she was probably a lot more educated than the vast majority of women living in Rome in that period. She could speak 9 languages, we're told. She's very clever. She's very good at talking to people in their own manner of speaking. She was quite a sort of chameleonic character. So she was really poles apart from your average Roman woman who was quite cloistered by comparison.
Now, Lloyd, you've written a book about the other Cleopatras. We have to remember that Cleopatra wasn't the only Cleopatra. There was a dynasty there. And was Cleopatra exceptional in Egypt, or was just one of a series?
Well, yes, she was the 7th of this dynasty of women, and I think that she was very aware of her family history. And basically, she molded herself on the successful blueprint that had been created by her mother, her grandmother, her aunt, this whole group of these. Cleopatra III is probably even a greater mover and shaker in the Hellenistic world than Cleopatra VII was in the Roman world. But what's kind of interesting about what we've done with Cleopatra, and it starts, as Daisy says, in the Roman period itself, is that we've mythologized her. Essentially, we've taken the image of Cleopatra VII and created a sort of blank page for her, and then we've projected whatever we want to see onto that page. The Romans create her as this fatale monstrum, there's this terrible, fatal monster. By the Renaissance, she's Shakespeare's tragic queen. Today, she's a heroine for Black Lives Matter, for the Me Too movement. Groups have always claimed Cleopatra VII. And therefore, in many respects, we tend to see her in the historiography as this kind of lone wolf figure, a woman out of time, out of place. She's extraordinary. But what my book argues is actually, yes, she was all those brilliant things, but actually we can find and place her very securely into the world of political maneuverings in which the women of Egypt in this dynasty, in the dying years of the Ptolemaic dynasty, were the most powerful, the most effective rulers, and just happened to rule over, or be married to, very often, brothers who were politically inept, essentially. So women found their space, their time in this period. And Cleopatra is very much part of that whole thing.
But I guess one big difference for when she came to Rome was that in Egypt, the Cleopatras were all considered divine. The notion of the Ptolemies created this convenient notion that they were all demigods.
This is a thing about the Ptolemies. Ever since Ptolemy I, there had been this movement of actually picking up on pharaonic precedent, of course, to see the kings and queens of the Ptolemaic period, and these are all Greeks, essentially, as divine figures. But that really suited Julius Caesar at that point. And in fact, we know that when Julius Caesar, before he went down to Egypt and first met Cleopatra, when he was at Ephesus in Asia Minor, he was awarded divine honors by the citizens of Ephesus. And Cleopatra, who at that time was in exile in Palestine, she writes to him and says welcome to the club. It's good to be a god, isn't it, So this really suited Caesar's mentality at the time to ally himself with this divine feminine.
But it was also quite good for women that it was equal status in terms of they were all gods. They were gods because they were royal. So
I don't think it's about equal status. I think what's fascinating about Egypt from the pharaonic period on, and this is what the Ptolemies really picked up on, was Egypt was all about balance. Everything works in twos in Egypt. There's Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, the red crown, the white crown. It's all about duality. And Egypt felt secure when there was a male and a female on the throne. And so...
Yeah, but that's a difference, isn't it? That's an important difference.
A very important difference.
No one in Rome ever said we wanted to have a male and a female consul.
But,
you know?
but you couldn't have a woman without the man. That was anathema to them, you know. Yeah. So they are taboo makers as well.
Okay, well that's the Cleopatras. Now we turn to Tom to deal with Caesar. How did Caesar?
How did Caesar end up?
No.
Getting Cleopatra into his bed. Is that what you're asking for?
Well, yeah. Tell us why he wanted to get Cleopatra into his bed and what he got out of it.
I mean, everyone laughs at that because the implication is that we know why Caesar wants Cleopatra in his bed. But there are profound issues of realpolitik at stake. And despite Cleopatra's reputation as a man-eater, as far as we know, she only ever slept with 2 men. And both of them happened to be the most important man in the world at the time. So I think you can gauge what Cleopatra was seeing in Julius Caesar and Antony. And I suspect the same is true of Caesar, that he is actually, he is a man who has gambled, who is famed for his qualities of dash and celerity. But in Egypt, he's really up against it. He has, by this point, he's conquered Gaul. He's become fabulously wealthy. He's won himself extraordinary renown as a great conqueror, as a great benefactor of the Roman people. But this has provoked the envy of many of his peers who have long detested him, essentially as a kind of criminal. I guess the closest analogy to how Caesar is seen by his enemies in Rome would be to think, well, how does the New York Times or CNN view Trump? There's a quality of that. And they're desperate to bring him down, to back him into a corner, actually a bit like with Trump, to bring him down by legal means. And he's been told that he has to surrender his command. He can't come to Rome and he can't run for consulship without doing that, and that would leave him open to prosecution. So Caesar has this awful decision to make. Does he uphold the constitution but risk the ruin of his entire career at the hands of his enemies in the law courts, or does he advance from the limits of his province, invade Italy, and uphold his dignitas? And Caesar, being Caesar, decides to go for the latter option. He crosses the tiny river that marks the frontier of his province with Italy, a river called the Rubicon. And the Senate, his senatorial enemies, under the command of his erstwhile son-in-law, partner in carving up the Republic, and only peer as a great general, Pompey the Great. He is now Caesar's enemy. Caesar pursues Pompey across the Adriatic into Greece. There is a great battle that Caesar wins against the odds. Pompey flees the battlefield, flees Greece, and Pompey has won his glory in the east of the Mediterranean, and he has all these kings, these little kind of tiny despots in his train. They are his clients. And perhaps the greatest of all of these is in Egypt. And so Pompey thinks, right, well, I'll go to Egypt. Egypt is by far the richest power in the eastern Mediterranean. I will go there. I will seize the treasury. I will use that to raise fresh armies to have another crack at Caesar. He lands. The Egyptians can tell the way the wind is blowing, and instead of welcoming him, they stab him to death. And it is said that when Caesar arrives in Alexandria in pursuit, he gazes at Pompey's head on a platter and weeps. And one has to suspect that they were crocodile tears to a very strong degree. And he's then faced with the decision of what does he do in Alexandria? He hasn't brought many troops with him. But he is Caesar. He is the man who has defeated the greatest general in Rome. He's the conqueror of Gaul. He has the arrogance that follows from that, and he assumes that essentially that Egypt is his to do with as he pleases. Cleopatra is a young queen, but as Lloyd said, she can't rule as queen without a brother to serve as king, and there is a kind of horrible younger brother that she has to put up with, and essentially they hate each other so much that civil war has broken out between the two siblings. Caesar sets himself up in the royal palace of the Ptolemies, very high-handed manner, and while he's there, according to tradition, which I like to believe in, a laundry bag or a carpet or something of that ilk is brought into his quarters, and either bursting out of the laundry bag or being unrolled from the carpet, ba-ba, it's Cleopatra. And Caesar promptly beds her. But in doing that, he is making a political decision. And I think he is already looking ahead to the possibilities that would ensue for him if he could father an heir to the Egyptian throne on this Queen of Egypt. So he is playing Cleopatra as well as Cleopatra is playing him. And I think it reflects Cleopatra's shrewdness and her understanding of Caesar's character that she has herself brought to him in the way that she is. Because later, when she meets Antony, she goes for the full-scale, Hollywood epic presentation. Because Antony is a much more vulgar man than Caesar.
I think you're absolutely right. I think Cleopatra understands. As you say, Tom, she's only got these two monogamous relationships, really, yet we've created this femme fatale for her. But she does know how to play them. So with Caesar, it's a match of minds, most definitely, and they both get off on the politics. But with Mark Antony, absolutely. I mean, he was a blunt squaddy, essentially, with a soldier's tastes. And Cleopatra recognized that, and she went out and played essentially the glamorous Hollywood starlet. I mean, when Liz Taylor was cast as Cleopatra, that is exactly what Cleopatra did for Mark Antony. So she played them off, against each other constantly, the men in her life. And it was said that had Octavian, the future Augustus, been successful, with persuading her to stay alive, she probably would have made a pass at him in some sort of way as well, and adapted herself to suit his character too.
The very difficult thing for Cleopatra, of course, she's got this much younger brother, but he's got these advisors who are completely dominant. So she's not just against him; she's against a whole team of people. The eunuch is probably the worst of them. She's outnumbered.
Is it fair to say, though, that Caesar and, to a degree, Mark Antony were actually both used to dealing with very strong women? I mean, because it is quite easy to tell the story of the ancient world as women being very suppressed and and kept down. And obviously, to a degree, and we come to some of the detail of that later, there's some truth in that. But in fact, Caesar was surrounded by some very strong women who had genuinely, it's thought, considerable influence over him. Is that not right?
What?
Tell me about Servilia.
Servilia is probably, I'd say, the most powerful woman out of all the. I mean, Caesar is completely sexually incontinent, particularly other senators' wives. He was all over the place, and he married several times. But Servilia is his long-standing mistress, and she's the mother of Brutus, who will ultimately do the terrible deed and kill him. But she seems to have had a great influence over him. I mean, Caesar had huge affection for her. We're told that he bought a pearl worth 6 million sesterces for her, which probably the money for that came from, Lloyd will probably correct me, from Cleopatra's father, possibly. He was desperate at that time to become an ally and friend of the Roman people. So overnight, she became one of the wealthiest women in Rome, and that's not to be sniffed at, that's important. Later, when Brutus is on the losing side of the battle, Caesar actually ensures that his life is saved, and that's clearly as a favour to Servilia. Caesar lines Brutus up for a consulship for later on. This actually happens after, this is lined up for after Julius Caesar dies, and then Servilia is left in this impossible position. She's essentially got her lover versus her son. And the whole thing is made even more complicated by the fact that she's a half-sister of Cato, who is the arch-enemy of Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar knew how to sort of wind people up. So it all became very, very difficult. But I think the thing that sticks in my mind and really attests to Servilia's prominence is the fact that after Julius Caesar dies, her son, Brutus, is assigned to some really kind of lowly, in her eyes, position, overseeing the grain commission instead of having this great political career. And she actually has that overturned in the senatorial decree. So that shows a woman actually wading into politics in a way that we're not really aware that other women were doing.
I mean, women can't run for political office, but if they are aristocratic, they can wield enormous power, and they're expected to wield power because they are agents of the familiar to which they belong. And Romans have a much more open attitude to marriage and divorce than we do. And just as it's the role of the son of a great aristocrat, a great nobleman, to go off and conquer provinces or run for the consulship or whatever, so it is the role of women to marry into other dynastic families and to kind of basically be the ambassador in the other family's villas for their father. And this gives potentially women enormous power. And the most aristocratic, the most powerful of all women are figures of considerable menace in Rome. And so the most notorious of these, you said how Romans don't engage in incest, but it is a recurrent accusation among the Romans that the most powerful aristocratic families, those who disdain to share their power with other Roman families, do actually engage in incest. And the most famous woman who is accused of this is a woman called Clodia, which is a kind of mockney. She's a Claudia, but she's affecting a kind of plebeian slang, as her younger brother Clodius, who is an absolute troublemaker. Cicero's great enemy. He kind of essentially invents gangsterism, paramilitaries, floods the streets, intimidates Pompey, is an absolute loose cannon, but he is said to have slept with his elder sister. And whether this is true or not, it reflects the fact that there is a sense that the Claudians are just so terrifying and so close that they would only deign to sleep with each other. And so I think that it's not a political queenly role as Cleopatra has, but the power behind the scenes is enormous. And in due course, Clodius's wife Fulvia will marry Antony, and she's a shocker. So when Cicero gets his head chopped off and is brought to her, she takes out the pins from her hair and stabs his tongue with the pins, or so it's said, and basically launches a war against the young Octavian. And of course, Octavian ends up married to Livia, who anyone who's seen I, Claudius will remember her proficiency. And again, whether the stories that are told about Livia are true, we can't possibly know. But it is taken for granted that Livia, she has the status of someone who is the real power behind the throne.
I think we could stick with Fulvia for a minute, because she says a very good book, a bit about Fulvia in Daisy's book. Fulvia is normally projected in that particular way, basically the person who put her needle through Cicero's tongue, so not great. But if you pick her career out, her various husbands, she's one of the few Roman women who I think one could begin to think of constructing a life. I mean, she had relationships with 3 very close Caesareans, and if you put them all together as you do, it makes a very different picture.
She's incredibly ambitious, I think, not just for the men around her, but she's one of those women who is kind of forced almost into the limelight, whether she likes it or not. And she's determined to make the best of it at that point. So when Clodius, this terrible sort of demagogue I was describing, when he's killed, his body is returned to Rome, and the matronly thing at that moment to do would be to close the doors and to tend the body quietly. Instead, she flings those doors open, makes sure the mob sees how this bloodied corpse of her husband, and so she can whip up resentment and ill feeling against his enemy who's killed him, Milo, and his gang in Rome. And that's just the very beginning of her career.
And then they burn down the Senate.
They burn down the Senate as a first, and this is all at her instigation.
Yeah.
It's incredible. She creates a scene all over the place, and this is commented on all throughout her life about what a meddler she is in political affairs, what a troublemaker she is, and how it would be better if she was dead because she creates so much trouble for the men around her. The war is particularly interesting that she fights while Mark Antony is away with Cleopatra. It's claimed in the sources she does this in order to extricate her husband from Cleopatra's grip. This is the sole reason for her stirring up this war. In my mind, it's much more in order to change the balance of power between Mark Antony and Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. She fights this war in Perugia. It turns out into this horrible, bloody siege, 41 to 40 BC. And at the end of it, she's on the losing side, and Mark Antony shows absolutely no thanks to her whatsoever. But we're talking about sort of sources and how much we believe, and with Livia and everyone else. With this particular instance, we do actually have bullets, the lead slingshot bullets, which are engraved with these terrible messages aimed at Fulvia's. The one that actually famously says, "I'm aiming for Fulvia's clitoris." And there you have, actually dug up from the site of the siege. We're very lucky to have that evidence in that particular case with Livia and so many of the other women. We don't have that circumstantial evidence to back up what's written in the written sources.
And I think that brings us to the question of historiography generally, and how ancient women, and influential women in particular, have been treated by historians, not just in ancient Rome itself, but across the centuries. So Balsden's book there from 1962 begins with a kind of an apology to his reading public. It kind of says, in my leisure time, between writing proper military history and the history of politics, I turned my attention to women. I hope my reader will forgive me for that. And I think that's the kind of shadow that we've been under for a long time. Women's history in antiquity didn't really come into its own until the 1980s, essentially with the second feminist movement. And now, it has its place, but there is still a lot that we have to unravel and we have to acknowledge. In the case of the Cleopatras, for instance, they were all very able rulers, exceptionally gifted diplomats. They were courageous, very often they led wars themselves. But in the historiography, since the 1950s, essentially, they are labeled as Hyrcanian tigresses and out of control, harpies, harridans, emotional. All of the things that men were praised for, the Cleopatras did. But they get judged on a very different level indeed. These are women out of control. And it's still there in the historiography. And, I'm glad to say that, hopefully, we're going to start changing that narrative. But we're fighting against a very compelling and strong tide.
But although we're to fight against it, it's also an important way of understanding it, isn't it? I mean, ancient politics worked by creating differences between one lot of people and the other. I mean, Balsden's other book was about Romans and aliens. I mean, Romans were sort of equal opportunity racists,
aliens.
If you like.
Not in flying saucers.
So they looked for difference wherever they could find difference. They didn't mind it.
I think always the abuse tells you how people are seen, and how people are seen in turn reflects realities on the ground. So, for instance, the charges of incest against Clodia and Clodius, which Cicero goes to town in his great speech, the Procailio, is it true? I mean, we will never know. I would say the likelihood is that it isn't. But the idea that the greatest families are so close that they can be accused of incest, I think that reflects a fact that in the late Republic, these aristocratic dynasties are massive, massive players, and so you can kind of learn from that. And likewise, the accusations that are levelled against Cleopatra by Octavian and his propagandists, I mean, they tell you a lot, of course, about Roman attitudes, not just to powerful women, but to royalty, to people in the East, to Greeks. I mean, all kinds of objects of Roman contempt. But equally, there is in the abuse that is directed at them elements of truth, because otherwise they wouldn't work. And so it's a kind of question of panning this abuse to see what kind of fragments of truth you might be able to pan.
So the rhetoric of incest, for instance, which was going around amongst the Romans, is clearly part of that othering that is inherent in the process of the Romans looking at the Egyptians. They say, oh, they worship animal-headed deities, they have all these bizarre rites, and sleeping with your brother is another one of those. When you look at the Egyptian aspect of this, it's one of the most important points in Egyptian royal ideology for the Ptolemies. So for them, because they saw themselves as divine figures, and it's kind of hard for us to get our minds around the fact that these are human beings who are seen as living gods, they use incest as a political tool. As far as they're concerned, they go back to the mythology. So in Egyptian mythology, we have the goddess Isis who marries and has a child by her brother, husband Osiris. And in the Greek world, Hera, the goddess Hera, marries and has children by her divine brother, husband Zeus. So basically, by using this incest theme, the Ptolemies, these Greek rulers in Egypt, were drawing on these true ancient traditions and saying, look, we are different, we are above you. It was about keeping the blood pure, it's something different. And after all, there is something about the incest myth. Anthropologists talk about something called the yuck factor when we talk about incest. We all go, ugh, But what it does within these ideologies is to put the practitioners of incest on another level entirely. Oedipus, in Sophocles' great tragedy, is an incestuous character, of course, But what title does Sophocles give him? It's Oedipus the king. And in a way, his kingship is dependent upon the incest as well. It marks him out as something different.
It's worth it. We just go forward a few years to the life of Caligula, when Caligula, who is having who is very impassioned with one of his sisters.
Or so it's said.
It's said to have been impassioned with one of his sisters, and one of his aides is asked by Caligula, have you had sex with your sister? And the aide is very uncertain what to answer, because if he answers yes, then Caligula might say, well, that's disgusting, or he might say, oh, well, actually, only I'm allowed to do that. So the very clever aide, who survived quite well, says, not yet. Which is a way of and actually one of Caligula's sisters wasn't she the first Roman woman to become a god?
Yeah.
Drusilla.
Yeah, Drusilla. I mean, he's such a slept with all three of his sisters at one point, but there's one he had a particular favourite.
I mean, the thing about the incestual thing, we're playing quite a lot on this, aren't we?
That's what people love.
I should say, in the Ptolemaic world, this isn't just lip service to this. This is real, genuine, physical, sexual coupling and having children who then go on to marry their brothers and sisters too. The most remarkable thing about this, and sadly we have no osteoarchaeological evidence for the Ptolemies. We don't have their bones. We don't know what this was doing to them. But the Ptolemies ruled for the longest dynasty in Egypt's history, 300 years. If we think about what the Habsburgs did in a similar period, and this was generally uncles bedding nieces, which is one step away. We saw by the end of, Carlos II could barely function as a human being. So we don't know what state the Ptolemies were in at all. And therefore, some of the arrows that are fired by the Romans at the Ptolemies may be sensible. They may really have been reflecting a physical kind of corruption or breakdown that the Romans like to play on. So we can't dismiss all of that.
But also, I mean, just to emphasise that although the Ptolemies are drawing on the kind of the ancient majesty of Egypt, there is also a vein of contempt for that in the Ptolemaic court as well, because the Ptolemies are Macedonian and they see themselves as the ultimate guardians of the glory that was Greece, particularly with. By the time of Cleopatra's life, when virtually every other independent Greek kingdom has been snuffed out. Yeah. And I think that for the Romans, it's the Greekness of Cleopatra that is an absolutely crucial part of her appeal. So when Caesar has basically won the civil war for Cleopatra and installed her as the throne, he then goes on a kind of Nile cruise, and it's said that he would have gone as far, to the source of the Nile if he hadn't been summoned back by his soldiers to go off and fight the Roman civil war. So clearly, the antiquities of ancient Egypt do have a kind of appeal, but Caesar and Cleopatra are talking in Greek. I think that of Cleopatra's languages, Latin is not one of them.
No.
And she's the first Ptolemy to speak Egyptian, isn't she? And there's always that sense that, that Alexandria is a city of citizens. The Ptolemies are citizens of Alexandria, and that it is perched on the edge of Egypt. It's Alexandria on the margins of Egypt.
I think it's worth, before we throw it open, excuse me, sorry. The Greekness to this is obviously very important, and the Greek, although the Macedonians had snubbed out and got rid of a particular kind of Athenian democracy, which we all now, prize and think is so marvellous, I think it's worth thinking about the role of women within that democracy. The time when the Greeks had this, well, we call it democracy. We still call it democracy. And it was sort of this great achievement. It didn't last very long, but it was a great achievement. Women had actually one of the least power. It was a very
they
bad
have a different
time.
power. They have a power because they mediate between the gods. And we might say, oh, well, that's rubbish. But it wasn't to the Athenians. The role of Athenian men was to fight and legislate in the earthly dimension. But the sense that women had a role as mediators between the demos, and the demos, the people, doesn't mean really what it means to us. It's not an electorate. It's the mass of earth-sprung people in Attica who have lived, who are living, and who will live. And it's, the duty of care that women have towards that demos is, I think, just as important as men. It's just that we, our understanding of democracy is rights-based, and that's not at all the case in Athens.
But Daisy, surely, okay, well, let's give you that. But actually, the price of a lot of men doing not very much, apart from being politicians and being part of this demos, was paid by a lot of women who were not part of this. And we'll forget about, we can deal with the slaves, but a lot of them were women too.
Think of Pericles, great architect of that democracy. He supposedly said, "Great is the glory of the woman who is least spoken about, whether for good or for ill." We can't prove whether he said that or not, but that is the words attributed to him. And I think for the most part, certainly in public life, women were living in a real dark age at that point. They were very cloistered, and they could communicate with the gods. They could be in temples, but they had no sort of political voice of any kind. They couldn't vote. This obviously isn't unusual in the ancient world, but the 5th century BC seems to have been a particularly bad time to be a woman.
Yeah, that's always. Surely that's true, Tom, isn't it?
I think
it was
if
always
you have
a
the
bad time to be
perspective
a
of
woman.
someone living in a 21st century democracy, in which feminist notions are completely enshrined and ideologically based, I think Athens is so alien, so remote, so distant, so difficult to get a handle on, because it's not just that we don't believe in the Greek gods. By and large, historians, when they write, are not they're not factoring in the dimension of the supernatural at all. I think it is really, really important, and I think the mediating role that women play in Athenian culture, and also, so the role that Cleopatra plays, she's brilliant at that. She can, because she's a woman in Egypt, she can play the part of Isis, and she can channel all that means. And that's one of the reasons, again, why she and Caesar are so keen to have a son, because Caesar having a son by the new Isis is casting him as Osiris, as an Egyptian god, in a way that the mass of the Egyptians can recognize, and it's casting their son as Horus. And these are patterns of relationship to the divine and therefore to political reality that to a Roman seems mad, but it's the marker of Caesar's genius and ability that he is able to exploit it. And in due course, Antony does the same. So, he marries Cleopatra, and they have children, and there's a kind of notorious episode where he and Cleopatra kind of hand out various provinces of Roman provinces, or so it is spun in Rome, because there what Antony is doing. Antony is he's not nearly as smart and subtle a politician as Caesar, and he's not as powerful as Caesar either, and so it's easier for Octavian, his great enemy back in Rome, to misrepresent the propagandistic elements of what Antony is doing and cast him not as a partner in a kind of sophisticated political maneuver, but as the dupe, the slave of a foreigner who is a queen, boo hiss, and a woman, boo hiss. But in the Egyptian context, it's genius strategy.
I think what Tom says about women's role within a spiritual, and we can't even use the word religious because it didn't exist for the Greeks at all. It was the divine experience or the communication. I think it's very important. I think the word priestess, for instance, that we use constantly, it doesn't do justice to the way in which women, especially in the context of the home, the oikos, propitiated gods, worked with the gods constantly. But from my own research about women in 5th century Athens, as Daisy says, I think the closest parallel I can draw, and my first book ever 25 years ago is called Aphrodite's Tortoise, The Veiled Women of Ancient Greece, in which I argue that women were heavily veiled, as much as you would ever see in a Middle East country today, something that classicists can't, at the time, before I wrote the book, couldn't cope with because they can't think of a democratic society covering its women in a kind of Eastern way, but they certainly did. And I think, given the laws, so for instance, you couldn't speak a woman's name in public because that would be dishonor, not to the woman because she doesn't have any honor, but to her family, to her husband, to her father, to her brothers. When women are brought up in courts, in legislation, she is only known as the wife of, the mother of, the daughter of. To speak the name of a woman just brings terrible shame to the family. We have evidence in Athens of women being beaten by a police force called gounaikonomoi, which essentially means those who police women's behavior, so that if they are too loud in public, if they don't cover up correctly, they are beaten. The closest thing I can come to in that respect is that this is a Taliban existence in what we want to see as the world's first democracy. It's far from it. I don't want to downplay what you say, Tom. I think they have an incredibly important role, but it is so withdrawn within the oikos. Otherwise, they are chattel. They can't own anything. They can't have money. They have no rights to divorce. If a woman has a child by her husband and it's decided that he wants to take a new wife for usually political reasons, she has to immediately give up all rights to that child. Nothing at all. Just, even the discrepancy in marriage age, a girl of 12 would usually marry a man for the first time. He was about 37 to 40. That meant in a woman's life, she could go through 3, 4, 5 marriages and have nothing at the end of it.
We should never forget that was true in England in a very large respect until the middle of the 19th century. So we can't, before we're too snooty about our improvement upon the ancient world. Now, I think we should ask you if you'd like to ask our distinguished panel anything. And if anybody raises their hand, I will point to them and a microphone will be directed in their direction. I think, sir, you were very early in this business.
Thank you. Thank you for that fantastically interesting talk. Going back to the union or match with Caesar and Cleopatra, was there any evidence or sense that Julius Caesar could fantasize or think about or entertain the idea of being simultaneously an absolute Hellenistic monarch in Egypt whilst being dictator or permaconsul in Rome? And likewise, did Cleopatra have possibly an idea that she could be a queen, possibly, of the Roman polity because Caesar was in charge of it?
I don't think the latter, but my hunch, and we don't have hard evidence for this, but my hunch would be that part of the fascination of Cleopatra for Caesar is that he recognises in her a model for rule that has simply not been available to even the most powerful of Roman figures, because they belong to a republic in which the name of monarch, whether it be king or queen, is absolute poison. Caesar finds, I think, in Cleopatra, who is smart and clever and sophisticated and adept at playing politics, a model of how he, perhaps as the supreme figure in the Republic, could exercise power in the East. And I think that there's evidence, I think the evidence of his life in Rome after he has won the Civil War and has had himself made first dictator and then dictator, a perpetual dictator for life, is that he's impatient with the kind of the pettifogging of his erstwhile peers. He's bored of them. He despises them. He looks down on them. He's become impatient with them, and before he is assassinated before he can leave on another great war against Parthia, this which again is a kind of sub-Hellenistic kingdom in the Near East. And I think that one of the reasons that he's going is simply that he's going back to a world where he can be a general with his soldiers and he can play the part of a Hellenistic king with the peoples in the provinces that he's moving forward, and he doesn't have to worry about the Republic, which he notoriously says is just a name. He says of the Republic, it's nothing, it's just a name.
The gentleman there, I can see in a white shirt.
To Cleopatra, she's descended from Macedonian Greeks, but also she's sort of taken on and kind of gone native in a way. She's playing as a demigod. So how Greek and how Egyptian is she? What's the mix?
Yeah, it's
Well,
interesting. So her name, her full title is Cleopatra Philippatros, the lover of the beloved of the father, or the beloved of the fatherland. And therefore you can ask, well, what is the fatherland that she's alluding to? Is it the ancestral lands in Macedon, or is it Egypt? And I think after 300 years of rule, and knowing that Cleopatra's whole fixation really was on securing the succession for her son, Caesarion, I think that she saw herself as a proper Egyptian. I think the Macedonian link was disappearing generation by generation. And we know that Cleopatra VII, more than any other Ptolemy, as Tom said, she spoke Egyptian, but she also courted the Upper Egypt as well. So, from Luxor down to Aswan, her presence there was everywhere. I mean, we know that she went and she installed a new Buchist bull, for instance. She establishes shrines, including a shrine just outside of Luxor, which has now disappeared, sadly, in the 19th century, which showed her giving birth to Caesarion in that area. So I think that for her, she was Egyptian. That's the thing that mattered most to her. In that, I think Shakespeare gets it right.
A gentleman there, yes.
Thank you. To what extent, if at all, do we have any women on the record from this period? And is this more about sort of looking afresh or reinterpreting the male record from this period, but through a modern post-feminist kind of view?
Well, unfortunately, we don't really have any surviving writing by women from this period. There are a few little bits and pieces that we have, like bits of poetry. We know that women were writing, but they haven't been preserved, what they did create. There's an exception. There's a woman we might have spoken about called Cornelia, and we have a substantial section of a letter. She was the mother of the Gracchi brothers, who really overturned Roman politics in the sort of towards the 1st century BC. But people have questioned whether that's even authentic. So when we're talking about sort of women in this period, we are really having to look at what men have written about them and try to sort of unpick why they've been presented in certain ways, what tropes come up. We talked a lot about incest. Incest, one of those things which is a charge levelled against women all over the place. So many different women from this period are accused of that. Clearly, it wasn't that widespread. So it really is a question of reading things, I think, with a slightly more open mind than has always been applied to the work to date.
Sometimes the material record, the visual culture, can tell us a bit more. So in the case of Cleopatra VII, for instance, we can follow her life through her coins that she mints, and each die is very unique to her. So when she first is a queen in Egypt by herself, having thrown off her brother, or at least not recognizing him as king, she is shown as a young Greek woman with her hair in a bun, and she wears a diadem, a simple cloth thing, and she looks the youthful girl that she is. And we can trace her portraiture generally getting more and more sort of authoritative throughout her life, until the final set of coins that she had minted came from Antioch. And this is when she was with Antony and basically was setting herself up against Rome. And in that, she has a real masculine quality. Some historians have even said she looks like Mark Antony in drag, because she looks kind of rough and brutal. And what she's doing there, I think, was changing from that pretty young girl into, I will contend with Rome, and I will be like any other Roman. So in fact, I would say that Cleopatra's idea of launching herself into the Roman Empire is there in her iconography.
It's almost like going all the way back in time. If you look at sort of Hatshepsut,
Yeah,
like back
absolutely.
in Egypt, she had herself, to the early Egyptian ruler, she was shown with a beard and in men's clothes in Egyptian art. And there's various reasons being put forward for that as well. So she's almost going all the way back.
Yeah.
There's a lady there, I think, in a white. I can see a white sleeve. I think. Yeah.
Really fascinating talk. Before you were sort of talking about double standards, I guess, between how men would act and women act the same way but be treated differently. And it got me thinking, I guess, whether almost the lack of distinction between the idea of masculinity and the idea of femininity in Egypt, if maybe that was sort of one of the main reasons why the Romans sort of, didn't like Egypt and were so dismissive and maybe even afraid of Egypt. But,
Lloyd, that's the one for you, I'd say.
I think there's something about that. And to be fair, women in Egypt in the Ptolemaic period had more freedoms than anywhere else in the ancient world. They could own their own properties. They had their own rights to divorce. It was actually a very forward-thinking world in that respect. So, to a large respect, it was the antithesis of the Roman and certainly of the Greek experience. But I wouldn't want to overemphasize that, because we've gone through the Hellenistic world and that has changed a little bit. I think that generally, though, when we think about the classical world, we are dealing with a world of polarities. So ever since the 5th century, philosophers have been thinking about this world where there are diametric opposites. There is the city and there is the wild. There is the cooked, there is the raw. There is the woman, there is the man. There is the civilized, there is the barbarian. And Egypt, in a way, not simply Egypt, but other non-Greek or Latin-speaking communities are very often filtered through that idea of these oppositions constantly. And I think Egypt and certainly under Cleopatra, a female barbarian ruler, I mean, it culminates at that point.
I mean, I think the Roman understanding of sex is very radically different to ours, and to explain how and why would result in filth. So I won't go, as it were, too hard into that. But it imposes on Roman men an absolute paranoia about being seen as effeminate, about playing the part of a woman, whether sexually or even psychologically or spiritually. And the masculine cast of Roman power is taken for granted. And so it is assumed that peoples who have been conquered and enslaved must have been so because they have been softened, and their softness is equated with slavery. So in this period, the fact that Egypt is a land where people can wear diaphanous silks, where eunuchs are employed, where women have political power, would absolutely represent for, I think, the average Roman. They would say, well, what do you expect? This is a feminized, soft country that deserves the slavery, deserves the prostration that we are going to impose on it. And that is very much the role that Octavian, when he arrives as a conqueror in Alexandria, plays. He has cast Antony as someone who has become soft, who has literally put on Cleopatra's clothes, and Cleopatra has put on his clothes. It's a shocking reversal. He treats he's asked, would you like to come and see the tombs of the Ptolemies? And he says he's not interested in looking at the tombs, basically, of women. He's not interested in that. And I don't think he would ever have fallen for the blandishments of Cleopatra. He is playing the part of a Roman who is contemptuous of everything that Egypt represents, and he's setting himself not just against Antony, but also implicitly against Caesar himself. And so the feminine character of Egypt is a constant that as long as the Romans have engagement with Egypt it runs throughout. And for instance, Egyptian men, it's Egyptian men who are seen as being effeminate. Egyptian women are seen as being terrifying viragos. And so the crowds in Alexandria, the mobs, are famously, notoriously arbiters of political power through the Ptolemaic period into the Roman imperial period. And Romans are terrified by the way in which it is said that women protesters, women rioters, will reach out and grab men's testicles and crush them. And this is an occupational hazard for a Roman, going to Alexandria and getting caught up in a riot, and then, And this is a measure of how sinister Egypt is, that the women are more predatory and terrifying than the soft, sweating, blobby Egyptian men.
There's been some really good work done by Roman art historians on Roman statuary and gendering of statuary. Glenys Davis at Edinburgh, and she's shown these incredible, basically it's body language reading, So all of these statues of splayed, toga-wearing men, or arms up holding javelins, or else, the orb here. And then all these images of what the Romans admired in women was called pudicitia, and that is, she's got her head covered, she pulls her veil around, she makes as little space for herself as possible, and that says a lot as well about the gender identity that the Romans wanted. So woe betide any woman like Cleopatra who could splay herself out to show her power.
Yeah.
I reckon we might have time for one more question.
I find it amazing that there were no physical consequences of centuries of brothers marrying sisters, and there's no evidence at all of the biological or genetic consequences.
Sadly not. No, the only bones we have, and it's much debated, were found in Ephesus, where we know we have the tomb of Cleopatra VII's younger sister, Arsinoe, and certainly the bones that have been found there are of a woman of the age of late 20s, so it feasibly could be her, but they don't really provide us with much DNA evidence, unfortunately.
I'm just surprised it was practical, after.
Absolutely.
We can't extract the DNA and have Ptolemy Park.
No, exactly. Fabulous. Oh, all of them in their caftans.
Yeah.
Superb.
I think what's interesting is that
Running around committing incest, and getting off with presidents.
Under Claudius, they actually do change the rules in Rome to allow, for the first time, marriage between uncles and their nieces. And I think it's said that only 2 couples are actually recorded at that time of taking advantage of this new rule.
But that's because the emperor
and the emperor himself wants to marry his niece.
The bizarre thing
Agrippina,
is that in Athens, in the 5th and 4th centuries, uncle-niece marriage was the most common form of all. So they're only one step away from incest, really, the Athenians were.
Well, I mean, based on Athenian tragedy,
Exactly.
they were all committing incest.
Well, I'm afraid we got into incest very early. And,
and we kept going.
And on that note.
We've hit our end moment on the same subject. So thank you all very, very much to our panel. I hope you all will buy their books and enjoy them, as I have. And thank you all for being such a great audience. Thank you.